From the poorest farmer eating gray boiled grain out of a pot that has been simmering on the same fire for weeks, to the king sitting down to 30 dishes he can't name until a servant announces them. This is how 100,000 people ate in the Middle Ages. With no fridge, no freezer, and no tin, how do you keep an entire winter's worth of meat from killing you? There is an answer, and it isn't salt. And who actually ate better, the peasant or the king? You think you know. You don't, and the reason is the last thing in this video. It's 4 in the morning in an English village in the year 1300. There's no clock. What wakes the house is the cold. The first job of the day isn't food, it's fire. Last night the woman of the house buried the hot coals under ash to keep them alive. That's where the word curfew comes from. Couvre-feu, cover the fire. Banked properly, she blows an ember back to life in a minute. Banked badly, she's walking to a neighbor's in the dark to borrow flame because striking a light with flint and steel takes 15 minutes on a wet morning. Everything else depends on that ember. Over the fire goes the most important object in the medieval world that nobody talks about, the pot. One iron pot on a chain over a hearth in the middle of the floor. There's no chimney. The smoke just goes up through the thatch. Remember that, it comes back later. Almost everything this family eats is cooked in that pot, and it's almost never emptied. Last night's leftovers stay in. This morning she adds water, dried peas, barley, whatever's in the garden. That's pottage. It isn't a recipe. It's a rolling, permanently refilled stew that runs for weeks. And they probably don't sit down to breakfast. The church discouraged eating before morning mass, so the first food of the day is bread and a cup of ale, standing up on the way out the door. The ale matters more than the bread. Everyone drinks it, children included. Not to get drunk. It's weak, 1 or 2%, boiled during brewing, and it carries real calories. Recorded allowances for working men run up to 1 gallon a day. Water, food, and wages in 1 cup. By first light, the men are in the fields. The main meal, dinner, is 5 hours away. Supper comes at dusk. 2 meals. That's the day. Bread is the foundation of this entire diet, and the loaf on your table announces your rank before you open your mouth. At the bottom, rye, barley, and maslin, wheat and rye, sown deliberately in the same field so that if one fails, the other still gives you something. In a bad year, you're eating bread ground from peas and beans. They called it horse bread because in a good year, that's who ate it. Climb the ladder and the flour gets whiter because white flour is bran sifted out through finer and finer cloth, and every sift throws weight away. White bread is the visible act of throwing food away. That's the flex. At the Lord's table, stale loaves become plates. A thick slab of old bread, a trencher laid on the board with meat piled on top, soaking up juices all through the meal. Afterwards, they're collected and given to the poor at the gate. Some households fed dozens of people a day on their own used dishes. Now, here's the part that makes people angry once they understand it. The peasant grows the grain. The peasant does not own the right to turn it into flour. On most manors, the Lord holds a monopoly on the mill. You bring him your grain, and he takes a cut off the top, the mull share, anywhere from 1/12 to 1/30. And the unfree paid worse. On some estates, a serf handed over 1/13, where a free man paid 1/24 for identical work. Grinding at home was restricted, though never fully stamped out. Historians reckon 1/5 of all grain was still ground domestically, usually by women on hand querns. But the moment a hand mill dented the Lord's income, he went to law and sent men to seize the stones. How much did people resent this? At St. Albans, an abbot confiscated the townspeople's hand mills in the 1330s and had the stones set into the abbey parlor floor, a monument to who had won. In 1381, when the rising reached the town, the men tore those stones out of the floor, smashed them, and handed the fragments to the crowd, deliberately imitating the giving of blessed bread after Mass. The abbey's own chronicler recorded it in horror. That's how personal bread was. To feed 100,000 people, you need a system, and it looks nothing like a farm you've seen. There are no fences. The village land is one open field cut into narrow strips, and a family's holding isn't a block. It's 20 or 30 strips scattered across the parish. That sounds insane. It isn't. Everyone gets a share of the good drainage and the bad. It's crop insurance built into the map. Most villages run 3 fields on rotation, one in winter grain, one in spring grain, barley, oats, and critically peas and beans, which put nitrogen back into the soil, though nobody knows why it works, and one lying fallow, grazed and manured back to life. So, 1/3 of your land grows nothing at all, every year, on purpose. Then there's the number that reframes the entire Middle Ages. So 1 seed of wheat and a typical harvest gives you back 3 or 4. One Sussex estate recorded barley at 3 and 3/4 seeds per seed sown. Good land might reach 7. A modern wheat crop returns something like 40, which means 1/4 to 1/3 of every harvest is set aside immediately, untouchable, uneatable, as next year's seed corn. You're eating 2/3 of a harvest that was never big to begin with. That's why the plow matters. Turning wet, northern clay takes a team of up to 8 oxen, and almost nobody owns 8. A well-off villager owns 2, so they pool them. Your dinner in October depends on staying on speaking terms with your neighbors in April, and the whole year is decided in 1 month. Harvest, August into September, every hand turned out. On top of your own strips, you owe the Lord boon work, unpaid days cutting his grain at the exact moment your own crop stands ripe and the weather could break. 3 weeks of rain in the wrong fortnight, and the village starves in March. So what does that put on a plate? A man doing this work burns 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, and roughly 3/4 arrive as grain. Bread and pottage. That's the engine. Around it goes whatever the household can scrape together. Leeks, cabbage, onions, turnips, dried peas, eggs from a few hens, cheese and butter, called white meats, and treated as poor people's food, not luxury. And the pig, because a pig feeds itself. In autumn, you drive it into the Lord's woodland to eat fallen acorns. That's pan-age, and yes, you pay a fee for it. Bacon in the rafters is what separates a family that's coping from one that isn't. Beef is rare. An ox is a tractor, not a meal. You eat it when it's too old to pull. Then the church imposes its own calendar. No meat on Fridays, often Wednesdays and Saturdays, and none through Lent. Between 130 and 150 meatless days a year. So fish becomes structural. Not fresh fish, salted herring by the barrel and stockfish. Cod air-dried in Norway until it has the density of a plank, so hard you beat it with a hammer before soaking it for days. Beyond that, gleaning the fields after harvest, which was a rite, not charity. Nuts, berries, wild greens off the common, rabbits and pigeons, if you dared, both belonged to the Lord. And here's the modern technology part, done fast, because you already know there's no fridge. The bigger absence is the one nobody expects. There are no potatoes in this world, no tomatoes, no maize, no peppers, no chocolate. All of it is still on the far side of an ocean nobody has crossed. This diet isn't just missing appliances. It's missing half the ingredients. Which brings us to the real skill of the medieval year. Not cooking, storing. Everything here is a race against rot, and there are only about 5 weapons. Salt. Salt pulls water out of meat, and bacteria can't work without water. Beef and pork go into barrels of brine or get dry-packed in coarse salt for weeks. It works so well that salt becomes strategic. Evaporated in coastal pans, mined at Lüneburg, shipped out of the Bay of Bournemouth. Entire trade routes exist for one mineral because the alternative is watching your winter rot. Smoke. Remember that house with no chimney? Hang a side of bacon in the roof, and the smoke wrecking your lungs is also drying and preserving your dinner. Those blackened rafters aren't neglect. They're a working appliance. Drying. Peas and beans dried hard in sacks, the backbone of winter pottage. Apples sliced and dried, fish on racks in the wind. Acid. Vegetables pickled in vinegar or verjuice, the sour juice of unripe grapes. Fruit kept in honey because sugar is an imported medicine you can't afford. Cheese and ale. Both are storage if you think properly. Cheese is milk you can keep a year. Ale is barley you can keep a month. But none of those is the real answer to the question I opened with. The best method is the one people forget, and it's the simplest. Don't kill it yet. The finest refrigerator in the Middle Ages is a living animal. Fish ponds stocked with carp and pike beside every monastery and manor, so you can pull a fresh fish out on a Friday in February. Dovecotes holding hundreds of pigeons. Fresh meat all winter, a privilege reserved for lords. Rabbit warrens. Live eels in barrels. You don't preserve the meat. You postpone it. And then, 1 week a year, that logic collapses, because you can't feed every animal through winter. There isn't the fodder. So, in November, the Anglo-Saxons called it Blotmonath, blood month. You decide which animals live until spring and kill the rest. Around Martinmas, the 11th of November, whole villages slaughter at once. Every part is used. Blood into puddings, fat rendered to lard, offal eaten immediately because it won't keep, the rest into salt. For about 2 weeks, the poorest people in Europe eat better than at any other point in the year. Then comes the part nobody makes documentaries about. February to June, stores running down, the new crop in the ground but not ready, hens stopped laying, cows dry. They called it the Hungry Gap. Almost everyone who starves in the Middle Ages starves in spring, standing in a field full of growing food. We cover stories like this every week. If you want to keep going deeper, subscribe. Now, climb a rung. Above the cottager with 5 acres sits the villager holding 30, a yardland, with oxen, a pig, poultry, and crucially, a surplus to sell. Above him, the priest, the reeve, and the franklin. A free man, wheat bread daily, meat several times a week. Then walk into a town and the system changes shape completely because a townsman grows nothing. He buys. And most townhouses have no oven, which produces something that will sound familiar. The cook shop. A description of London from the 1170s praises a riverside kitchen selling roast, fried and boiled meat at any hour, at any price, for rich and poor alike. Medieval takeaway. It existed, and moralists hated it. That dependence needs policing. The assize of bread and ale fixed the weight of a penny loaf to the grain price, and bakers caught selling short were dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf round their neck. This is the class that starts eating for pleasure instead of survival. A merchant buys pepper, not because he needs it, because everyone at the table can see he could afford it. In the Great Hall, food stops being fuel and becomes theater. The hall is a diagram of rank. The Lord sits raised on a dais, and the further away you sit, the worse your bread, the thinner your wine, and the later the dish reaches you. Diners are grouped in messes of 4 sharing dishes, and what reaches your mess is decided by where you sit. The meat is constant: beef, mutton, pork, and above that game, venison from deer that legally belong to the Lord, protected by forest law with brutal penalties for poaching. And birds, endlessly: partridge, heron, crane, swan. At the top, a peacock roasted and redressed in its own skin and feathers, carried in with the tail fanned. It reportedly tastes terrible. Not the point. Then the spices, which are the whole status system in a locked box. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, everyone carried from Asia through a dozen middlemen. Saffron, one of the most expensive substances that will ever enter a kitchen. There's a myth that spices hid rotten meat. It's backwards. Anyone who could afford cinnamon could afford fresh meat. Spices were used because they were expensive. That was the message. At the top, the scale stops making sense. A royal household is a food organization with a monarch attached, hundreds of staff across pantry, buttery, scullery, spicery, and kitchen, feeding a moving population of servants, soldiers, and guests every day. Around 1390, the chief master cooks of Richard II compiled a recipe collection called The Form of Curry, and its preamble tells you how this world saw itself. It calls Richard the best and most royal provider of food of all Christian kings, and notes the book was assembled with the advice of the masters of physic and philosophy at his court, because at this level, food is medicine, and medicine has staff. Here's the strangest consequence. The king doesn't stay anywhere. The court moves constantly, castle to castle, partly for politics, partly for hunting, and partly for a very simple reason. A court that size eats a district empty in weeks. When it arrives, royal officers exercise purveyance, requisitioning food and carts from local people at a price the crown sets. It was hated enough that limiting it appears directly in Magna Carta. The king isn't just fed by the country, he physically consumes his way across it, which leaves the second question. Peasant or king, who ate better? The king's diet is a disaster. Vast quantities of meat, almost no vegetables. Nobles regard green food as peasant fodder. Heavy salt, heavy wine, sugar in everything. The results are all over the medical writing of the period: gout, stones, rotten teeth, deficiency symptoms by late winter. Meanwhile, the peasant, in a good year, eats whole grain bread, legumes, vegetables, dairy, and modest meat, and does 10 hours of physical labor. On paper, that's the better diet. The catch is those 3 words: in a good year. When it rains through 2 summers, as it did in 1315 and 1316, the harvest fails across northern Europe. Death toll estimates run from 5 to 15% depending on region, and it wasn't only grain. A cattle plague tore through the same years and killed up to 80% of some herds. No meat, no milk, no manure, and no oxen to pull the plow that would have grown the recovery. The Lord's household ate. The village did not. Then in 1348, the plague arrives and kills between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone, and in the horrible arithmetic that follows, survivors become scarce. Wages rise. Within a generation, English harvest workers refuse to work unless they're fed fresh meat and white wheat bread, the exact loaf that used to mean nobility. Governments passed laws trying to force them back down. It didn't work. So the honest answer to how 100,000 medieval people fed themselves: a pot that never got emptied, a barrel of salt, one animal kept alive as long as possible, and a harvest that gave back 3 seeds for everyone they buried. The farmer we started with never saw a single dish from the king's table, but his grandchildren ate white bread and meat, and it took the worst catastrophe in European history to put it there. More like this every week. Subscribe.